The fourth part of this series will demonstrate that the history of the modern world, from the tumultuous French Revolution to the complex geopolitical landscape of the 21st century, has been precisely foretold in the prophecies of the biblical book of Daniel, chapter 11. The analysis will center on Daniel 11:40, a capstone verse that not only describes our current era, but also serves as a key to unlock the preceding verses in a modern cyclical context. This verse reads, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, and with horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over." A foundational interpretive principle, often termed repeat and enlarge, suggests that biblical prophecy frequently revisits themes, expanding their scope and scale with each iteration. This report will apply this principle to show how the ancient regional conflicts between the king of the north, the Seleucid Empire, and the king of the south, the Ptolemaic kingdom, find a modern parallel that escalates dramatically. The battlefield shifts from the Levant to the entire globe, and the nature of the conflict evolves from dynastic struggles to all-encompassing ideological, military, technological, and economic warfare.
Tariffs are the future of this nation.
The major historical epochs, linking each to its corresponding prophetic passage. By cross-referencing the biblical text with factual historical events, this report will construct a cohesive timeline, demonstrating a clear and compelling fulfillment of the prophecy, culminating in the world we inhabit today. The prophecy of Daniel 11:40 begins with a crucial time marker, "and at the time of the end." This phrase points not to the end of the world itself, but to the conclusion of a specific prophetic period, the 1260 years of papal temporal supremacy foretold in Daniel 7:25 and Revelation 13:5. This timeline, starting in 538 AD, culminates in the year 1798, an era defined by an event that shattered the old world order, the French Revolution's war on the Catholic Church. The French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, was more than a political upheaval. It was a radical ideological movement that sought to remake society on the principles of secularism and reason. The Catholic Church, as a cornerstone of the monarchical ancient regime, became a primary target. The revolutionary government launched a systematic campaign of de-Christianization, a deliberate effort to erase Christianity from public life. This assault began with the confiscation of all church lands in 1789 to solve a state financial crisis. It escalated with the civil constitution of the clergy in 1790, which transformed priests into paid state employees forced to swear allegiance to the state above the Pope, splitting the clergy and creating deep resentment. During the most radical phase, the Reign of Terror, 1793 to 1794, this campaign reached its zenith. Churches were vandalized and converted into temples of reason, where secular festivals were held to celebrate Enlightenment ideals. The Christian Gregorian calendar was abolished and replaced with a new Republican calendar, which eliminated Sundays and religious holidays. restructuring time itself to break the church's influence on daily life. This was a clear attempt to replace the aesthetic and moral power of religion with a new, state-centered ideology. This conflict between revolutionary France and the papacy reached its climax in 1798. Under the Directory government, French armies led by General Louis-Alexandre Berthier invaded Italy, targeting the Papal States, territories ruled directly by the Pope for over a millennium. In February 1798, French troops entered Rome and proclaimed a new Roman Republic. Pope Pius VI, then in his 80s, was arrested in the Sistine Chapel while celebrating the anniversary of his coronation. When the French demanded he renounce his temporal, earthly, power, he famously replied,
"You can have my kingdoms, but the keys of St. Peter are in my hands."
Refusing to submit, he was deposed, arrested, and deported from Rome. He was moved from city to city as a French prisoner, ultimately dying in exile in Valence, France, in 1799. To the revolutionaries and many observers across Europe, the capture and death of the Pope in captivity symbolized the ultimate triumph of secular state power over religious authority. For the first time in centuries, the Pope was not a king but a prisoner, and the Church had lost its kingdom. This event represents the deadly wound to papal temporal power, precisely fulfilling the 1260-year prophecy and marking the beginning of the time of the end. So which one is the king of the North and which one is the king of the South during the French Revolution? To understand the dispute between the king of the South and the king of the North, it is necessary to review the history of their ongoing conflict. The record of this begins in verses 3 through 15 of this chapter. Into the chaos and power vacuum created by the French Revolution stepped a figure who would dominate the age. The prophecy of Daniel 11:3 states, "And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." This figure is identified as Napoleon Bonaparte, a man whose rise was made possible by the very forces that had wounded the papacy. The French Revolution, after its initial fervor, had descended into the bloody reign of terror, and then the corrupt, unstable rule of the Directory, 1795 to 1799. By the late 1790s, the French people were exhausted by a decade of turmoil and yearned for a strong leader who could restore order and national glory. While politicians squabbled in Paris, Napoleon was earning a reputation as a military genius in his Italian and Egyptian campaigns. He returned to France in 1799 as a national hero and, seeing the Directory's weakness, executed a swift coup d'état on 18 Brumaire, November 9, 1799. He established a new government, the Consulate, with himself as first consul, a position that granted him dictatorial powers. Napoleon's genius was not merely military, but also political and psychological. He understood the importance of aesthetic power, the ability to command through images, symbols, and grand gestures. He commissioned leading artists like Jacques-Louis David to create heroic, almost mythological portraits of him, such as the famous Napoleon Crossing the Alps, which depicts him as a serene master of chaos, a far cry from the reality of his crossing on a mule. He consciously co-opted the symbolism of the Roman Empire, adopting titles like consul and later emperor, and using the Roman eagle as his standard to connect his rule to a legacy of imperial glory and order. Crucially, Napoleon recognized that to unify France, he had to resolve the religious schism caused by the revolution. He saw the weakened church not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a tool to be controlled. This led to the Concordat of 1801, a landmark agreement with the newly elected Pope Pius VII. The Concordat was a brilliant political maneuver that appeared to restore Catholicism, but in reality subjugated it to the state. While it recognized Catholicism as the religion of the great majority of French citizens, it was not made the official state religion, preserving religious freedom. More importantly, the Pope agreed that the Church would not reclaim its lands confiscated during the Revolution, and Napoleon gained the power to nominate bishops, who then had to swear an oath of loyalty to him. The clergy effectively became a branch of the civil service, loyal to the state first. The relationship between the wounding of the papacy in 1798 and the rise of Napoleon is not coincidental, but causal. The revolution's de-Christianization campaign shattered the church's independent temporal power, creating a spiritual and political void. Napoleon's specific brand of secular imperial power, which required the legitimizing aura of religion without its political authority, could only have emerged after the old, powerful, land-owning church was broken. His self-coronation in 1804 at Notre Dame Cathedral was the ultimate symbol of this new order. By inviting Pope Pius VII to officiate, only to take the crown from the Pope's hands and place it on his own head, Napoleon sent a clear message. His authority came from himself, not from God, and the Church was present merely to endorse his power, not to bestow it. From this consolidated base of power, Napoleon embarked on a series of military campaigns. He revolutionized warfare with his Grande Armée, organized into smaller, self-sufficient corps that could march separately and converge rapidly to annihilate the enemy. His use of forced marches and living off the land gave his army a speed that consistently stunned his opponents. Masterpieces of strategy like the Ulm campaign, 1805, where he encircled and captured an entire Austrian army without a major battle, and the Battle of Austerlitz, 1805, his most celebrated tactical victory, allowed him to shatter coalitions and redraw the map of Europe. He dissolved the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire and installed his family members as rulers of conquered territories. In a few short years, he had become the undisputed master of continental Europe, truly a mighty king who ruled with great dominion and did according to his will. Napoleon's dominion, however vast, was not destined to last or to be passed down through his lineage. The prophecy of Daniel 11:4 continues, "And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others besides those." Following Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 and his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, The great powers of Europe convened at the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, to dismantle his empire and restore a balance of power to the continent. The principal architects of this new European order were the four dominant nations of the victorious coalition, the Quadruple Alliance, which can be seen as the four winds of heaven mentioned in the prophecy. These four powers were: 1. The Austrian Empire, led by the influential statesman Clemens von Metternich. 2. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, a dominant naval power represented by Lord Castlereagh and the Duke of Wellington. 3. The Kingdom of Prussia, an emerging military power under King Frederick William III. 4. The Russian Empire, a formidable land power led by Tsar Alexander I. These four nations were the primary coalition responsible for Napoleon's overthrow. Their goal at the Congress was to contain France, restore deposed monarchies, and create a stable Europe where no single nation could again achieve the dominance Napoleon had. While the resulting European order, often called the Concert of Europe, eventually operated as a pentarchy, rule of five, by including the restored Kingdom of France, the prophetic focus remains on the four victorious powers. France, as the origin of Napoleon's dominion, was the very entity being plucked up and divided. The prophecy in Daniel 11:4 specifies the empire shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. This aligns perfectly with the historical reality. Napoleon's empire was not passed to his son, his posterity, nor did it retain its power, his dominion. Instead, it was dismantled by the four winds of the Quadruple Alliance, who then dictated the new European structure. The evidence for this is overwhelming and formed the central strategic goal of the Congress of Vienna. Here are the key historical arguments and policies used to suppress and contain France. 1. The Second Treaty of Paris, 1815. After Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo during the 100 Days, the Allies imposed a much harsher treaty than the one from 1814. This new treaty was explicitly punitive. 2. Territorial reductions. France was reduced from its 1792 borders, which it kept in the first treaty, back to its 1790 borders. This stripped away minor but strategically important territories, such as the Saar Basin. 3. Crippling war indemnities. France was ordered to pay a massive war indemnity, reparations, of 700 million francs. This was a colossal sum intended to punish France, force it to pay for the cost of the war, and cripple its economy to prevent rapid rearmament. 4. Military occupation. An Allied army of 150,000 troops, commanded by the Duke of Wellington, was to occupy northeastern France for a period of 3 to 5 years. Crucially, France was forced to pay for the entire cost of this occupation, adding to its financial burden and serving as a daily humiliation and check on its sovereignty. 5. Creation of buffer states, cordon sanitaire. This was the main long-term strategy. The Congress of Vienna deliberately strengthened the nations bordering France to create a cordon sanitaire, quarantine line that could contain any future French aggression. Following the Napoleonic era, the prophetic narrative shapes a new political landscape. The identities of the King of the North and the King of the South are no longer determined by their geographic location relative to Israel, as in antiquity. Instead, their roles are defined by their character, political influence, and their place within a new and complex European order. The prophecy recorded in Daniel 11:5 presents a shift in power. "And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion." To understand the weight of this great dominion, we must first look to its initial historical fulfillment. Historically, this verse is applied to the chaotic period after the death of Alexander the Great, when his empire fractured among his generals, the Diadochi. The king of the south is identified as Ptolemy I Soter of Egypt. The prince, who rises strong above him, is understood to be Seleucus I Nicator, who had once served under Ptolemy. In this context, the term Great Dominion was a literal and undeniable description of territory. The Seleucid Empire at its zenith was a colossal landmass, stretching from modern-day Turkey to the borders of India. Its sheer geographical scale dwarfed the holdings of the other successor kingdoms, including Ptolemy's Egypt, often exceeding the other three combined. For this specific historical application, measuring the dominion by the size of the empire was the most direct and appropriate metric. However, a rigid adherence to the single interpretation creates a challenge when applying the prophecy to subsequent eras. If we insist that great dominion only and always refers to the largest physical territory, we risk limiting the text's prophetic depth. Biblical language is often dynamic, carrying meanings that can apply to different contexts in different ways. We must, therefore, examine the full scope of the word dominion from the Hebrew memshala. This term does not exclusively mean territory or land. Its core concept is about the act of ruling, the authority to rule over, to govern, or to reign. This authority is not always measured in square miles. A nation's dominion could just as accurately be defined by other metrics of power. 1. Population. A leader who governs an immense population, even in a geographically smaller area, certainly holds a great dominion. 2. Economic influence. A power that controls global trade, finance, or critical resources wields a vast dominion over other nations, regardless of its own borders. 3. Military and technological power. A state with unparalleled military might or technological supremacy effectively reigns over others, holding a dominion based on influence and coercion rather than land. This verse points to a rebalancing of power and the emergence of new political entities that form the backdrop for the next stage of the prophecy. A pivotal event in this restructuring was the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, known as the Ausgleich. This was not a unification, but a power-sharing agreement that created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. For decades, the Austrian Empire had struggled with the nationalist aspirations of its many ethnic groups, particularly the Hungarians. The Hungarian Revolution of 1848, though brutally crushed, had left a legacy of resentment and a desire for self-governance. By the 1860s, Austria's position was severely weakened by military defeats, most critically a catastrophic loss to Prussia in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. This defeat ended Austria's influence over the German states and exposed the weakness of its centralized government, forcing Emperor Franz Joseph I to seek a new arrangement to secure his empire. The Ausgleich of 1867 divided the empire into two co-equal states, the Austrian Empire, Cisleithania, and the Kingdom of Hungary, Transleithania. Each had its own parliament, prime minister, and laws for domestic affairs. They were united under a single monarch, Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, and shared three common ministries for foreign affairs, war, and the finance to fund them. This complex dual monarchy, a great dominion in its own right, set the stage for the personal and political drama that would fulfill the next verse of the prophecy.
The prophecy continues in Daniel 11:6. And in the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. You may recall from part 2 of this series the dramatic story of the political marriage between Berenice of Egypt and Antiochus II of the Seleucid Empire, a union sealed purely for political gain that ended in betrayal, poisoning, and catastrophic warfare. That was a disaster born of cold calculation. Now we arrive at a new union, one that, by contrast, begins as a beautiful, genuine, and defiant love story. However, while this political marriage may have a more romantic beginning, its ending will prove to be exponentially more dramatic and far more disastrous, creating a shockwave that will shatter empires and engulf the entire world in flames. This verse foretells a union, a marriage agreement that will bind two powers. In this modern fulfillment, the King of the North is clearly identified as the established imperial power, the Habsburg court of Austria-Hungary, represented by its heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The King of the South is the separate entity from which the bride originates, the rising powerful sphere of Prussia and the related German states. Crucially, it is through the prophesied marriage that this other main actor is revealed as the King of the South. The prophecy states, "The king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north," and this is fulfilled by Countess Sophie Chotek, who acts as the daughter or representative of this southern German power.
Sophie was born in 1868 in Stuttgart, the capital of the Kingdom of Württemberg, a German state. She hailed from a distinguished and ancient noble family from the Kingdom of Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, but crucially, her family was not of a reigning or formerly reigning dynasty. This fact was central to the controversy that would define her life. While serving as a lady-in-waiting to Archduchess Isabella, she met and fell deeply in love with Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Their relationship was a scandal in the rigid, protocol-bound Habsburg court. According to strict dynastic rules, an heir to the throne could only marry someone of equal royal rank. Sophie, despite her noble birth, was considered an unequal match. The discovery of their secret courtship led to a crisis.
Emperor Franz Joseph I vehemently opposed the union. However, Franz Ferdinand, known for his stubborn and determined character, refused to renounce Sophie. After intense pressure, a compromise was reached, an agreement that precisely matches the prophetic text. Franz Ferdinand would be allowed to marry Sophie, but it would be a morganatic marriage. On June 28, 1900, he was forced to make an oath of renunciation, formally declaring that his wife would not share his rank, and most importantly, that their children would have no rights to the throne. They were married on July 1, 1900. Sophie was given the title Duchess of Hohenberg, but she was subjected to constant public humiliation. At official court functions, she was not permitted to stand or sit beside her husband, but was forced to rank behind every archduchess by birth. Despite these slights, their marriage was by all accounts a devoted and happy one, producing 3 children. This union, born of love but bound by a restrictive political agreement, set the stage for a world-altering tragedy. The prophecy of Daniel 11:6 concludes with a grim prediction. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. This foretells the utter failure of the Union and the demise of both its central figures. This prophecy met its tragic fulfillment on a summer's day in Sarajevo. The phrase, "nor his arm," carries a profound double meaning. It refers not only to Franz Ferdinand's personal power, but also to his primary political vision, the very plan he believed would be his arm to save the ailing empire. As heir apparent, Franz Ferdinand was a reformer who recognized that the ethnic tensions between the Germans, Magyars, and Slavs threatened to tear the empire apart. He was a vocal critic of the dualist system established by the Ausgleich, which he felt gave too much power to the Hungarians at the expense of the Slavic populations. His proposed solution was a form of trialism, which would have restructured the empire into a triple monarchy, elevating the South Slavs to an equal political footing with the Austrians and Hungarians. He believed this would quell nationalist aspirations and secure the empire's future. This reformist plan, however, was perceived as a mortal threat by radical Serbian nationalists. Their dream was not a reformed and stabilized Austria-Hungary, but a unified and independent South Slav state, Yugoslavia, which would require carving territory away from the empire. Franz Ferdinand's plan to grant autonomy and power to Slavs within the empire would have undermined the very foundation of their secessionist movement. Thus, in a moment of profound tragic irony, the Archduke's political arm, his plan for peace and stability, was the very thing that marked him for death. In June 1914, Franz Ferdinand traveled to Sarajevo, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian province of Bosnia and Herzegovina, to inspect the army. The timing was dangerously provocative. His visit was scheduled for June 28th, a sacred day of Serbian nationalism marking the anniversary of the 1389 Battle of Kosovo. For Sophie, this trip was a rare occasion where, due to the military nature of the visit, she was allowed to appear publicly alongside her husband. On the morning of June 28th, as their motorcade drove through the city, a Serbian nationalist named Nedelja Chabrinović threw a bomb at their car. It bounced off the back and exploded,
injuring several people in the following car. Shaken but unharmed, the couple continued to a reception at the town hall. Afterward, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded officer in the hospital. In a fatal error, his driver was not informed of the change in plans and took a wrong turn down a side street. As the car stalled while trying to reverse, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, a member of the secret society known as the Black Hand, stepped forward from a cafe. He fired 2 shots at point-blank range. The first struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. Both died within minutes. The prophecy was fulfilled in its entirety. She shall be given up, and neither shall he stand. The assassination of the Archduke and his wife sent shockwaves across Europe, setting off a chain reaction of alliances and ultimatums that plunged the continent into the cataclysm of Great War, known as World War I, shattering the old world order forever. Daniel 11:7 states, "But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up at his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail." The devastation of World War I and the collapse of the old European empires created the conditions for the next phase of the prophecy. This figure, arising from the same Germanic roots as Sophie Chotek, is identified as Adolf Hitler. His estate was the broken and humiliated nation of post-World War I Germany. To understand Hitler's rise, one must first understand the state of the Weimar Republic, the fragile democracy established in Germany after the war. The nation was in chaos. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919, imposed crippling financial reparations, stripped Germany of territory, and forced it to accept all blame for the war, creating deep and lasting resentment. The German people were further traumatized by the economic collapse of the early 1920s, which saw hyperinflation wipe out the savings of the middle class. Just as a period of stability seemed to arrive, the Great Depression of 1929 plunged the nation back into despair, with mass unemployment and widespread poverty. These conditions created fertile ground for extremist political movements. Adolf Hitler, an Austrian-born corporal and failed artist, joined the small German Workers' Party and quickly became its leader, rebranding it as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. His message was simple and powerful. He blamed Germany's problems on the Treaty of Versailles, the weak Weimar government, Marxists, and, most viciously, the Jews. After a failed attempt to seize power by force in the 1923 beer hall putsch, Hitler adopted a new strategy: to use the democratic system to gain power and then destroy it from within. The Great Depression caused the Nazis' popularity to explode. By 1932, they were the largest party in the German parliament, the Reichstag. On January 30th, 1933, conservative politicians, believing they could control him, persuaded President Paul von Hindenburg to appoint him as chancellor. They were catastrophically wrong. Hitler moved with lightning speed, using the Reichstag fire as a pretext to suspend civil liberties and passing the Enabling Act, which effectively made him a legal dictator. As Hitler consolidated his power in Germany, he looked to another fascist dictator as a model, and eventually an ally, Benito Mussolini of Italy. In the early days, Hitler idolized Mussolini, whose 1922 March on Rome was the direct inspiration for Hitler's own failed putsch. After Hitler came to power, the relationship was initially tense,
with Mussolini viewing himself as the senior European statesman and wary of Hitler's ambitions in Austria. However, their interests began to align in the mid-1930s. Their first major military collaboration was their joint support for General Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. In 1936, they formalized their relationship with the Rome-Berlin Axis Treaty. By this time, the power dynamic had completely flipped. Germany's immense industrial and military strength dwarfed Italy's. Hitler was now the dominant senior partner. In May 1939, just months before the outbreak of World War II, they signed the Pact of Steel, a full military and political alliance that bound them together in the event of war. This Axis alliance, with its aggressive, expansionist ideology, represents the new King of the South in this enlarged prophetic fulfillment. The prophecy in Daniel 11:7 foretold that this new power shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the King of the North, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. This found its fulfillment in the outbreak of World War II, the most devastating conflict in human history. The King of the North in this context becomes the Allied powers of Europe, primarily Great Britain and France.
The war began on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. In response, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. The German army, the Wehrmacht, unleashed a new and terrifying form of warfare. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Using concentrated, fast-moving armored divisions and overwhelming air power, German forces achieved a series of stunning victories that fulfilled the prophecy that the King of the South would initially prevail. Poland fell in weeks. After a brief lull, the Blitzkrieg exploded across Western Europe in 1940. Germany invaded and conquered Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium. The German army then bypassed France's supposedly impenetrable Maginot Line, encircling the Allied armies and forcing the miraculous evacuation of over 300,000 soldiers from Dunkirk. By June 1940, France had surrendered, leaving Britain to stand alone.
We will fight on the beach!
For a time, it seemed the King of the South was invincible. This phase of the prophecy reveals a dramatic enlargement in the scale of conflict, a key feature of the prophetic pattern. The catalyst for World War I was a targeted assassination carried out by a small group with pistols and a bomb. The catalyst for World War II was the full-scale invasion of a sovereign nation by a mechanized army of millions, employing tanks, aircraft, and a doctrine of total warfare. The scope of violence and ambition had escalated exponentially, from a dynastic crisis to a global war of ideologies. However, the tide of the war eventually turned. A series of crucial battles marked the beginning of the end for the Axis powers. In the Pacific theater, the Battle of Midway, June 1942, was a decisive naval victory for the United States, which destroyed 4 of Japan's aircraft carriers and crippled its ability to wage an offensive war.
In Europe, the turning point was the brutal and catastrophic Battle of Stalingrad, late 1942 to early 1943. After a horrific siege, the German Sixth Army was encircled and forced to surrender. It was a crushing defeat from which the German army never fully recovered, and the Soviet Red Army began its relentless march toward Berlin. Following the D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, which opened a second front in Western Europe, the Axis powers were caught in a vice. The war in Europe ended with the fall of Berlin to Soviet troops, Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, and Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. The Second World War is over, but the great controversy between the King of the North and the King of the South is far from its conclusion. The biblical prophecy does not end its description of their struggle in verse 7. On the contrary, a long and detailed series of interactions is still laid out from verse 8 through verse 15. We must now get to know the new actors who will take the stage for this next sprawling phase of history. However, even though their subsequent back-and-forth conflicts will match the prophetic parallel of those verses, there is an additional overarching characteristic of this entire era that we need to review first. This defining feature is introduced in verse 40. With the defeat of the Axis powers in 1945, the wartime alliance of the victors quickly fractured, giving rise to a new global configuration of power that perfectly aligns with the final section of Daniel 11:40. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. The roles of the kings shifted once again. The king of the north became the United States and its Western allies, representing the capitalist democratic bloc. The king of the south, which had initiated the conflict in the previous phase, now became the Soviet Union and its satellite states, representing the communist totalitarian bloc. The prophecy's use of the word whirlwind is remarkably descriptive of the conflict that followed, which became known as the Cold War. A whirlwind, or tornado, is formed by the violent collision of two massive opposing air masses. Similarly, the Cold War was not a traditional war fought over a specific front or territory. It was a global, all-encompassing ideological clash between two fundamentally opposed systems of governance, economics, and belief. This whirlwind of conflict could manifest anywhere in the world where the spheres of influence of these two superpowers collided, from the major cities in Europe to the jungles of Southeast Asia and the mountains of Central Asia. It was a struggle fought through propaganda, espionage, political subversion, and technological competition. A disorienting and pervasive conflict that shaped the entire globe for nearly half a century. The prophecy then details the specific modes of this new warfare, beginning with the phrase, "with chariots." In a biblical context, chariots often represent elite, high-technology military power. The story of the prophet Elijah being taken to heaven in a chariot of fire provides a powerful link to an advanced, non-terrestrial technology. This finds its modern fulfillment in the space race, a spectacular duel for technological and science supremacy fought in the heavens. The space race was a central arena of the Cold War, driven by the fact that the rocket technology needed to launch a satellite into orbit was nearly identical to that needed to launch an intercontinental ballistic missile carrying a nuclear warhead. Success in space was a powerful form of propaganda meant to prove the superiority of one's political and economic system. The race began in earnest on October 4, 1957, when the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. This created a wave of fear in the United States, which responded by creating NASA in 1958 and pouring massive resources into science and education. The Soviets achieved another major victory on April 12, 1961, when cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. The United States, determined to catch up and surpass its rival, set the audacious goal of landing a man on the moon. This culminated on July 20, 1969, when Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to walk on the lunar surface, a moment considered a decisive victory for the United States in this technological contest. The race for the heavens, with its advanced rocketry and global prestige, was the modern-day war of chariots. The prophecy continues with the phrase, "and with horsemen," interpreted as mobile, land-based military forces. In the nuclear age, direct confrontation between the superpowers was unthinkable, as it would lead to mutually assured destruction. Therefore, the horsemen of the Cold War fought in proxy wars, armed conflicts where the United States and the Soviet Union would fight each other indirectly by supporting opposing sides in regional conflicts. These smaller nations became the battlegrounds where the superpowers tested their military capabilities, strategies, and resolve. This form of warfare defined the era, leading to some of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953. After World War II, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel. In 1950, the Soviet-backed Communist North Korea invaded the U.S.-supported South Korea. The United States led a United Nations coalition to defend the South, while the Soviet Union provided the North with arms and military planning, and China sent millions of troops. The war ended in a stalemate, with the peninsula remaining divided to this day. The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. Following the defeat of French colonial forces, Vietnam was divided into a communist North, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and an anti-communist South, heavily backed by the United States. The U.S. became directly involved with hundreds of thousands of troops in a long, divisive, and ultimately unsuccessful war to prevent a communist takeover of the South. The Soviet-Afghanistan War, 1979 to 1989. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a struggling communist government, the United States responded by launching a massive covert operation to arm and train the Afghan resistance fighters known as the Mujahideen. This decade-long conflict became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a costly quagmire that significantly contributed to its eventual economic and political collapse. In this enlarged context of the Cold War, the prophecy of Daniel 11:14 through 15 finds a second, more expansive fulfillment. And in those times, there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also, the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. In the 1980s, a powerful and informal partnership, later dubbed the Holy Alliance, was formed between U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II. The robbers of thy people referred to the Vatican Rome that has been robbing the people of God and even the world since dawn of time. They assert themselves to be included in the affair of nation after long without power. Both men survived assassination attempts just 6 weeks apart in 1981 and believed they had been saved for a shared purpose to defeat communism. Their vision was to support the pro-democracy solidarity movement in Poland, believing that a free Poland would be a dagger to the heart of the Soviet Empire. This alliance combined American economic and intelligence power with the moral and spiritual authority of the Polish-born Pope. When Poland's communist government declared martial law in 1981 and banned solidarity, the alliance worked covertly to keep the movement alive, smuggling in tons of equipment, printing presses, fax machines, and radios, and providing financial support through channels established by the CIA and the Catholic Church. This, combined with Reagan's massive U.S. military buildup and severe economic sanctions, put immense pressure on the Soviet Union.
However, the divine power is saying the otherwise. Daniel wrote in verse 15, "So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand." The most fenced city in this prophecy is undeniably Berlin. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II, the victorious Allies, the United States, Great Britain, and France, and the Soviet Union divided the country and its capital, Berlin, into 4 occupation zones. As the Cold War intensified, Germany split into 2 nations, democratic West Germany and communist East Germany. Berlin, located deep inside East Germany, remained similarly divided, with West Berlin becoming a prosperous, democratic enclave surrounded by the Soviet-controlled state. This open border within the city became a critical escape route for millions of East Germans fleeing to the West, a massive brain drain that was a massive economic and ideological embarrassment to the communist regime. To stop this mass exodus, the East German government, with the full backing of the USSR, took drastic action. In the dead of night, on August 13, 1961, they abruptly sealed the border with barbed wire and armed guards, which was quickly fortified into a formidable concrete barrier. This structure, officially named the Anti-Fascist Protection Rampart, but known to the world as the Berlin Wall, became the most potent physical symbol of the Iron Curtain, imprisoning East Germans and dividing a city for nearly 3 decades.
The air in the International Press Center in East Berlin on the evening of November 9, 1989, was thick with the familiar scent of cheap paper and bureaucratic indifference. For David Heston, a seasoned foreign correspondent, it was just another Thursday. He had covered the slow decay of the Eastern Bloc from a dozen such rooms, learning to filter out the predictable propaganda about agricultural yields and socialist solidarity. At the podium was Günter Schabowski, a Politburo official. Heston expected nothing more than the usual scripted monotony.
While a revolutionary fervor was undeniably sweeping the nation, with mass protests and a constant stream of citizens escaping to the west, the regime's press events remained stubbornly dull. Tonight felt no different. As the press conference neared its conclusion, Heston was already packing his briefcase. His mind was on the bland, forgettable story he would have to file about minor party reforms. It was then that an Italian journalist, Riccardo Ehrman, lobbed one last question into the stale air, asking about the promised new travel laws. Schabowski, looking weary, fumbled through a sheaf of papers that had been thrust into his hands just moments before he walked on stage. It was obvious to the reporters in the room that he was seeing the document for the first time. He began reading the text aloud in a flat, official tone. It stated that applications for private travel and permanent emigration would be granted. A low murmur went through the room. This was a significant development, but the language suggested a process, a set of procedures to be followed. The reporters, sensing a real story, leaned forward. Follow-up questions were shouted from all corners. It was a German journalist whose voice cut through the noise with the question that would ignite a continent. Wann tritt das in Kraft? Schabowski looked up from the page, his eyes scanning the text for an answer that wasn't there. He hesitated, shrugged, and in that single, unscripted moment of confusion, committed the most pivotal error of his life.
Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort, unverzüglich.
As far as I know, that is immediately, without delay. A wave of disbelief washed over the room. Heston looked at the journalist next to him, whose jaw had dropped. The silence was deafening for a beat. Then the room erupted. Questions rained down on Schabowski, who, visibly flustered, offered a few more uncertain affirmations before abruptly ending the conference. The reporters were left in a state of collective shock. Could it be true? Did an official just accidentally dismantle the Berlin Wall on live television?
I need a live feed right now. Get the team ready.
The press corps exploded into motion. It was a mad dash for the exits, a scramble for the nearest telephones. Heston felt a surge of adrenaline as he dialed his editor, his professional composure barely containing the historic weight of his words.
You're not going to believe this. They just opened the border. I think it was a mistake, but he said it was immediate.
The news flew across the wire services. West German television, the primary source of news for most East Berliners, made it their lead story. The anchor's confident announcement transformed Schabowski's confused statement into a fact. East Germany opens its borders. Heston knew he couldn't stay in the office. He grabbed his coat and ran out into the chilly November night, making his way to the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint. He found a small, tentative crowd already gathering, drawn by the broadcasts. They approached the border guards, who stared back with grim, confused faces. They had received no new orders. But the crowd swelled with impossible speed, from dozens to hundreds, then thousands. A single chant rose from the mass of people. Tore off, open the gate. The guards, pale and overwhelmed, radioed their superiors, but the chain of command was paralyzed. Finally, seeing no other way to avoid a violent stampede, the commanding officer at the checkpoint made a decision that would seal the fate of the Cold War. He ordered his men to open the barriers. Heston stood on the periphery, his notepad clutched in his hand, watching a tidal wave of joyous humanity pour into West Berlin. The scene was surreal, a spontaneous eruption of laughter, tears, and song. Strangers hugged, champagne bottles appeared from nowhere, and the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of hammers and picks began to echo as people started chipping away at the very symbol of their division.
The reporter, a lifelong observer of calculated political moves, realized he was witnessing something far more powerful. This wasn't a policy decision, it was a historical accident, a simple human stumble amplified by the media and seized upon by the unstoppable will of a people yearning to be free. The prophecy that they shall fall is thus fulfilled in a nuanced way. The alliance succeeded in its goal, but the final act was beyond its direct control. Following this victory, the historical roles of the key actors diminished. Reagan's presidency was over. The Cold War paradigm they had mastered became obsolete, and the world entered a new era. The alliance and the figures who defined it fall into the annals of history, superseded by the new world they helped create. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was the symbolic crack that shattered the foundation of the Soviet Union. The event triggered a rapid chain reaction, proving the USSR could no longer enforce its will upon its Eastern European satellite states, which quickly abandoned communism. This wave of liberation surged into the USSR's own constituent republics, where long-suppressed nationalist movements, empowered by Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, began demanding sovereignty. Throughout 1990 and 1991, republics like Lithuania, Estonia, Georgia, and Ukraine declared independence, tearing the fabric of the Union apart. The final, decisive blow came in August 1991 when a failed coup by communist hardliners against Gorbachev destroyed the last remnants of the central government's authority. In the aftermath, republic after republic seceded, culminating in the formal dissolution of the USSR on December 26, 1991, just over 2 years after the wall came down, officially ending the Cold War.
Even though the Cold War was over and the USSR had dissolved, the prophetic tension remained, poised to fulfill the last characteristic of verse 40. The end of the direct military standoff did not signify the end of the struggle itself. Instead, it marked a transition, setting the stage for the conflict to re-emerge in a new form. The final element of the prophecy is, "and with many ships," drawing from Psalm 107:23, which speaks of those who go down to the sea in ships that do business in great waters. This phrase is interpreted as representing economic and trade power. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the nature of the global conflict shifted again. The role of the King of the South transitioned from the militarily focused USSR to the rising economic superpower of China. The current geopolitical landscape is defined by this great power competition between the United States, the King of the North, and China, the new King of the South. The many ships symbolize the global supply chains, trade routes, and maritime commerce that form the primary battlefield of this new conflict. China has challenged the existing U.S.-led global economic system with its Belt and Road Initiative, a colossal global infrastructure project designed to expand its economic and political influence across Asia, Africa, and Europe. This initiative is seen by the U.S. and its allies as a strategic challenge to their interests. In response, the G7 countries, led by the U.S., have launched their own alternative infrastructure programs, such as the Build Back Better World Initiative, or B3W, to counterbalance China's influence. This ongoing rivalry for control of global trade and economic networks is the modern fulfillment of the war fought with many ships. Our study has now reached Daniel 11, verse 40, a passage associated with the time of the end. But the prophecy does not stop there. 5 significant verses remain, verses 41 through 45, which details subsequent events. These final passages are complex and have sparked considerable discussion. As we conclude this report, we're left with an open invitation to diligently study what comes next, seeking wisdom and understanding as we explore these profound prophecies together.